Hi everyone and welcome to another Wargaming terrain tutorial. This video today we're going to be looking at making some post-apocalyptic walls, as you can see here. Now these are modular and I will go through step by step how to make these particular walls. But my main aim for this video was to just show you some different techniques that you can use to add to your own buildings to get similar effects. So this is a bit of a long one, so let's get stuck straight into it. Alright, now for the main frames of these walls, we're going to be using this 1mm thick balsa wood here. You could probably use a different material. I find this stuff is fairly easy and cheap to get a hold of, so it's nice to work with. It's soft timber, it's easy to sand and shape if you need to, easy to cut. What I've done here is just cut down some strips of about 3 to 4 mils in width. You want to try and keep these as close as you can to the same width all the way across them, just to help with the build process a little bit down the track. But you don't need to be too precise. I just eyeballed all of mine and then trimmed them up to the right size. Now you would have seen me make I-beams before in a previous video. I did them for the tank traps quite a while back now. But we're going to just be using these strips here. I've cut the longest I need, roughly about 14 centimeters here. First thing I'm going to do is just sort of hold the first two pieces in place just to make one section a fairly nice sort of T shape. And what we're going to do is just using some super glue here. This is really quick drying super glue. It's the cheapest stuff I could find, but it's actually the best I've found for this job. So this super glue will set in a matter of a couple of seconds with this balsa wood. So once you've sort of got that first end glued in place, you can just sort of work your way down then and glue the other end in place, just making sure that you sort of keep it fairly in the middle before you hit it with that glue. And a few extra little spots to reinforce that join. And then we can add the third piece on. Again, just making sure that it's sort of in the middle, hold it in place. A little drop of super glue there does the trick. And once that first end is glued in place, you can sort of just work your way down and glue the rest of it. And I've got to make up quite a few different ones here, so quite a few long ones which will make up the main front wall section, and also a bunch of short ones which make up the side sections of the wall, as well as most of the vertical supports. Now when it comes to these walls, you sort of want to guess at what sort of scale you're looking for, what height you want, and that'll sort of determine what lengths of these I-beams you'll want in the end. Now you can sort of fit these into the sides of these I-beams here, which is why it's handy if you've sort of cut everything at the same sort of width when it comes to those strips of balsa. If you haven't though, it's easy enough, just trim a little bit down to make it fit in there. I've just measured up where I want that to sit on that on those vertical supports, and just marked it so that when I do come to glue it, that horizontal is fairly even and level. Now for this wall, I want these to be sort of slightly angled backwards at the top, so with the vertical supports I'm actually just sort of sanding a little bit of an angle to the base of these, just so it's a little bit easier for me to sort of work with and know how to glue the rest of it all together when it comes to the rest of the supports. So easy enough just with a couple of swipes of sandpaper to get a bit of an angled base on those, and then we can start gluing these vertical supports to our main horizontal here. Again, this super glue, as I said, sets in a couple of seconds, so once you've got it in place, you can go back through with that super glue and add in a few extra drops of super glue to support it in there, make sure it's not going to break down the track. I am going to add in some angled supports at the back of this wall section just to make sure that it can be freestanding. Again, just eyeballing it, doesn't matter if these are slightly different. There's sort of nothing too scientific about this construction. It is post-apocalyptic terrain, so it really doesn't matter if it's you know, uneven and you know, not perfectly square and straight everywhere. It really doesn't matter too much. I am just sort of sanding the base of these supports just to get a bit of an angle on there, so it will be easier to glue this to the base down the track. And I'm going to do this for both sides. So once I've sort of got that support, you do want to make sure that you are building this on a flat surface though, so that as you're putting these supports down, you can make sure that everything is touching on the base where it should be, just so that when we do glue it down to a base, we know that we've got as many contact points as we can. Once I've done that to that main front sectional wall, I'm actually going to glue on a couple of angled bits for the sides here. So the 5 sections of wall that I did build make up a small compound, that being the modular element of this, so you can sort of snug these up side by side. create a bit of a circular compound if you want, which is what I was going for with this. Again, like I mentioned at the start of the video here, this isn't necessarily a video to show you exactly how to make this step by step, although, you know, I do go through that. My main hope here is that you can sort of take some of these techniques or some of these materials and do your own thing with them, and this will sort of show you how I went about making these modular walls. I am going to add in additional supports here. This is just, again, the same strips of balsa that we cut earlier, and we're just going to glue these in diagonally and horizontally across these vertical supports. There's nothing neat or clean about any of this. I'm just trying to give this thing a little bit more structural integrity. Now these supports that I'm gluing in here at the moment, they're not going to be visible from the front, as they will be covered up with all the panels that we put on in the next steps. So it doesn't really matter how these go on, all they're there to do is to throw a little bit of support into this structure, and it'll give it a little bit more visual interest on the back of these walls as well. Once you've sort of got that all together, you can move on to the next step here, which is just to cut out our walkways. I've just measured up the distance we need in the middle, particularly for the flat section of the front of the wall, or in the middle of the wall I should say, and we're just going to cut these down. I'm using for a width of my walkways around about 4.5 centimeters, and the width here is going to be just a little bit wider than the inside of those two vertical supports, and I'll show you why that is in just a moment. But I'm using 1mm thick cardboard here for this. This works fine, easy enough to cut, easy enough to sort of add some details to after I get it cut to size. So you can see there that it's a little bit wider than it probably should be, or it could be. But what I'm going to do is just cut a couple of little sections out of each corner here, just so that this sits in nicely. This will just make it a little bit easier when I come to put in the diagonal walkways, or those angled walkways on the sides. So here you can see it sort of fits in there very nicely. It actually fits quite snug as well, which is perfect. And I've just cut some angled sections there as well. Now, I didn't measure those up or calculate those angles out at all. I just sort of put them side by side. I got it to fit and just trimmed those angles down until they fit in perfectly. Next thing I'm going to do with those walkways is just sort of mark out some sections to cut out, so that when I add my mesh sections on there, it's actually going to look sort of like industrial sort of walkways or something like that. Now I did just freehand in some sections to cut out, so there's nothing, you know, I didn't even have a sort of reference image for this. This first one I drew on was just, you know, it was probably a little bit more detailed, and when it came to cutting it out, it was a bit of a pain in the ass, but so this one is probably a lot more detailed than any of the other ones. All you really need to do here is just draw in some rectangles, a few triangles, you know, sort of try and make it symmetrical. So that when you add your meshing on there, or your grate on there, it's going to actually look like industrial walkway. You'll see how this comes together shortly, but using this 1mm thick cardboard, it's nice and easy to cut this stuff out anyway, so there's not too much trouble to it. Like I said, this was probably the most complicated one that I made. Most of the other ones were just fairly simple squares and triangles cut out of there. Can just freehand those on there. I don't think, again, it doesn't need to be perfect. Not everything needs to be, you know, millimeter perfect here when it comes to measurements and cutting out. So once you've got that cut out, these walkways, as you can see here, they're going to have these vertical supports at the back to hold it up nice and flat, and we can start looking at getting this all finally put together. So I've used this stuff before in a previous video. This is just some plasterer's tape, or plasterer's mesh I think it's called. This stuff is adhesive on one side, really great for building these walkways. You would have seen me do this for my fire escape and ladder video. I use the exact same stuff and it works perfectly. It is adhesive on one side, so once you cut it down to shape, you can just peel it off and stick it onto your piece of terrain. The adhesive isn't exactly the best, so you know, you may want to add a few drops of glue here or there just to hold it in place in the long term. But honestly, if you're going to be painting this down the track as well, particularly if you're going to hit this with Mod Podge and black paint, you probably don't need to really worry about gluing this on. I found with just a bit of paint over this at the end, it all's holding together really well. That adhesive is sticking on, so as you can see there, these are straight away looking pretty good. Not a lot of work to get those walkways or get that mesh onto those walkways. Just cut it down to size and just put it in place. Now these vertical supports I'm just hitting again with some quick dry super glue, and you I did my best to get these supports to be the exact right height that I wanted. But in the end, you'll see that some of them didn't turn out perfectly, but I did fix them, so you know, you don't need to worry too much if these supports are a little bit short, because we will sort of add some shims in there to kind of bring everything up so it sits nice and flat at the end. So we went through the exact same process for these angled sides of the walkway. We're not gluing this into place just yet because we are going to make the base first. Now to do that, I've just cut out a strip of 1mm thick cardboard here, just wide enough to fit the wall on there, and we just want to sort of mark out where we want where these vertical supports are, particularly because we do want to make sure that all of these are contacting with the base so that we've got areas to glue this all down. So here I'm just sort of drawing out roughly where I want to cut this. You don't need, you know, I found having slightly more organic shapes for these bases worked really well. And you want to make sure that it's not too wide outside of the wall, particularly if you're going to try and put these things side by side. You don't want these bases sort of overlapping or anything like that. It can make them look a little bit funny, but here you can see it fits just nicely onto that base. We're going to remove those walkways for the time being and just glue this down on all the contact points we have at the base. Again, I'm just using this super glue. Everything will be slightly reinforced down the track. Once we add on all the elements and all the ground covers, there'll be plenty of glue to hold this thing together, and there'll be plenty of different things glued onto it that will make sure that it's not going to break down the track. So you might be looking at this thinking it's flimsy as hell, but trust me, once it's all together, you could probably throw this thing against the wall, and I think it's going to hold together pretty well. I probably wouldn't advise that, but you know, for argument's sake, it's fairly strong once it's all done. So here I'm just sort of fixing up these vertical supports. As I mentioned before, these ones were a little bit short, so the walkway was a little bit angled downwards or backwards. So all I did was cut out a couple of little sections of balsa there and just add them in as shims. And honestly, once we add in our ground cover and stuff to this base, you're not going to see those anyway. So once you've got that glued on, we can now start looking at the panels for our walls. You could use anything here. I'm going to use as the base, I'm going to be using 1mm thick cardboard. You could use cereal box cardboard to glue this stuff together and finish off this paneling, but whatever you've got on hand should be fine. So long as you follow the similar process, it will all work out the same. So what I'm going to do is using some cut up cereal box cardboard. I've just cut some, you know, very rough squares and rectangles here. I'm also using some corrugated paper here, same thing, cut into squares and rectangles just to sort of look like sheets of corrugated iron and stuff like that, and scraps. And I'm just going to glue this onto that panel, and I do this process for all 3 panels of each wall. So that main middle section is built in exactly the same way, as well as the 2 side sections. Now you do want to make sure that your overlap makes sense, so you can see here that I'm actually gluing these a little bit above and below that actual wall section. That's just to make sure that there is a bit of cover at the top of the wall and that it does cover everything at the bottom. And you might just want to add a little bit at the top here on the inside of the wall, just to make sure that it sort of flows on the front and the back. So once you've got those panels glued onto that, you know, base structure of that 1mm thick cardboard, we can just go straight ahead and super glue this in place, and then we'll follow that through with the other 2 sections of that wall. Now the one thing I didn't film for this was just the priming, so all I did for that was just using a rattle can of matte black paint. I've just taken these outside and given them a good coat of that black paint, and that's basically it. I mean, I don't think I really need to film that. I'm sure you've seen or are familiar with how to use a spray can. Now once that's dried, I've come in now with some burnt umber craft paint, and I'm just stippling this all over the build. So I'm not actually painting this or trying to get full coverage at all. I'm just stippling this on to make this give it another color, give it a little bit of a dirty look, and we'll start building up onto that with some other colors as we go. So once that's done, I add in some silver paint to the edges, just going around and highlighting some of these edges, and also giving a little bit of a dry brush to try and bring up some of those edges of those panels and give a little bit more variation and highlight those panels a little bit more. These panels do look pretty dark, so adding in a little bit of color here and there is pretty important, I think. What I've done is, again, just using a stipple of paint here. I'm using some blue on some of these corrugated sheets. I'm just going in and sort of stippling on here, not trying to cover up and get blocks of color necessarily. I still want some of that black and that brown to show through on these panels, but you can use a variation of colors, browns, oranges, red as well. Just going through and just trying to pick out a few panels here and there to give a bit more variation. I've also used a gunmetal silver here to just sort of bring up some of the other panels, just to get some really bright ones in there if you like. You'd probably want to weather these down a little bit, or maybe give them a bit of a wash after the fact. But going in there, particularly getting panels that are sitting behind other panels and sort of hitting them with this gunmetal color, really did help to sort of break up this otherwise really dark kind of monotone wall that we've got. I found that was probably the biggest challenge of these, was to try and get them to stand out and not look so bland, which is where adding in these different colors and some of these different effects really did help. Now I did try stippling on some rust effect onto this, and it really didn't look right. I didn't feel it was working for me, so what I ended up doing was taking a really bright orange or a rust effect color and just watering it way down, and then just basically washing that front wall section. These I-beams I painted with a red-brown color here, just blocked in the colors there. And as you can see, the walls are starting to look okay. I kind of got the shits with painting them at this point, because it was still looking really dark. But what I did then was moved on to the bases. Now this sand stuff you would have seen me use in the scatter terrain that I did recently. This sand is just playground sand from the hardware store. I've actually coloured it with some pigment and added in some gravel and some brown battleground from Army Painter, just to give us some different textures and stuff. So if you want to check that out, I did just link that video, just using some PVA glue and gluing that down initially, and then going back in, as you can see here, with some watered down PVA glue again, just over the top of all this, just to make sure that none of that comes away in the future. So really important step to putting sand on your bases, I think, is to go back over it with some Mod Podge and water, or PVA glue and water, just to make sure that it is going to hold steady over time. Now I came back to these walls, trying to add in some more details, trying to bring up the colors, trying to you know, get away from that really dark look that I've got going there. So what I did was using some white, I've just gone in with a fine brush and started stippling in some just some symbols and some letters for some of these panels, just to try and you know, bring out the fact that this is all salvaged material. So none of this really needed to make too much sense. Like, you don't need full words, or you know, this is meant to be sort of salvaged scraps that we're using, so it doesn't matter if you know, you've got half words or just, you know, letters and numbers sort of poking out here and there. Again, you know, highlighting some of those panels behind other panels and just showing off a little bits of detail here and there work perfectly. I found these street signs on Google and printed them out. These are you know, really kind of bright and very stark as they go on here, so they're very very clean and fresh compared to the rest of these walls, but we will weather these down shortly. I just cut out a bunch of these and started placing them onto the walls themselves, again trying to look where I could sort of have these half showing, see if I could put them where they might make sense, you know, stops, keep out, you know, that sort of thing. Glued them around, and that's actually, it was one of the things that really started to make a difference. There was a bit of a turning point for this. I've gone back in with a bit of a brown wash, so you could use an Agrax Earthshade or a soft tone or something to just sort of wash over these, just to take the colour down a little bit and make them look more a part of this terrain rather than something sticking out as it was before. This really started to bring the build together, so a big thank you to Leif from Devs and Dice. We were talking about this build as I was going, and this was one of his ideas to sort of help break everything up a little bit, and it worked a treat. So those little signs really made a huge difference. Again, you just pick those up off Google, print them out and cut them out. They work fine. A little bit of PVA glue to stick them on, and as you can see, it made quite a bit of difference to the overall look of these in the end. So some final details I added on, some grass tufts obviously. I've also added in a few sticks and logs in the final build, just on that sand and basing, just to give a few more details. Whatever you've got really works. I've picked up some of my old terrain pieces, so here's an old shipping container I built way back when. I've used that in place of one of the walkways. I thought that looked pretty cool. You know, any of the old barrels, you know, those sorts of things. I found a couple of tires from some toy cars I placed around on some of these as well. That's what I like about this build, is it's really easy to sort of change this up, use what you've got on hand to add in the extra little details here and there. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Hopefully there's a few techniques in this that you'll be able to incorporate into your builds, something in your future projects. I've really enjoyed this one. Sorry it took me so long to get this one out. I have been a little bit ill lately, so this one took way longer than it should have, but I am planning some new videos very shortly. Hopefully you enjoy those as well. Remember to hit like if you enjoyed this video, or comment if you have any questions at all. I'm happy to help out anyone I can, whenever I can. Thank you very much to my Patreon supporters, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.